Cave Story is one of those games with an incredibly large cult following, and with a following like that comes fans that are extremely talented. All sorts of fan work has been made inspired by Cave Story, and mods of the original game are no exception. There's all sorts of mods out there, but I don't think there's one that's more famous or infamous than Jenka's Nightmare. Its development history is almost as old as Cave Story's. It was started all the way back in 2006 by one Mark Schmidt's Major, but it met the same fate as many other fan projects of its ilk and remained abandoned for a long time. In the early 2010s though, Zachary Zarosu Bailey picked up the pieces of this mod and completed it himself. This is the version I played last year or so, and it appears to be the definitive edition. What do I think of this mod, and is it worth playing if you're a fan of Cave Story? I'll just come out and say it. Jenka's Nightmare is a game with a lot of great ideas and executions, marred by an overall experience that's, for lack of a better word, a nightmare. It expands on Cave Story's faults just as much as it tries to recapture its greatness. As soon as the player gains control of Quote and Jenka's Nightmare, it's clear that the difficulty of this mod is going to be higher than the original game. That in and of itself is fine, since Jenka's Nightmare really shouldn't be played unless you've completed the game it's based off of. Oh yeah, spoilers for both games by the way. The first cave of Cave Story eases players into the game by keeping the amount of enemies to a minimum and having a small amount of two lethal hazards they'll be seeing for the remainder of the game. Water that can drown them, and red spikes. Initially Quote is defenseless, but quickly he gains a weapon to defend himself as well as a health upgrade. Not 5 minutes into the game and the player will already feel like they've made significant progress. The same can be said for Jenka's Nightmare. The skeleton of this idea remains, but there's differences that make the experience feel lesser. The player finds their first weapon just as fast, but instead of the Polar Star, it's a fairly obscure weapon from the original game, the Snake. When I first played this, I actually thought this was a good idea. The Snake is a weapon that usually gets ignored by players due to its obscurity and cost. In Cave Story, the player needed to trade both the Polar Star and Fireball at a certain point in the game to obtain this weapon. It's one of the 3 guns that can be traded for the Polar Star, and due to when it's obtained and what it's competing with, it's probably the weakest of the 3 options. The machine gun has significant power and earlier availability, and the Spur is the best gun in the game. Jenka's Nightmare had a chance to give the Snake more of a spotlight. After all, it's a pretty neat gun, being the only one to shoot projectiles that go through walls. Unfortunately, its time to shine is cut short due to the reappearance of the Polar Star several minutes later. The reason the Polar Star appears so early is likely because the player needs to be able to shoot through destructible blocks that impede your path. But I don't see why the level design couldn't have been adjusted to give the player a more significant amount of time where the Snake is their singular weapon. In addition to this, there's also been a change to the Snake itself. It has an ammo count now. Its ammo count is a paltry 20 shots that recharges at a slow rate. Both the ammo count and recharge rate can be increased as the game progresses, but it makes the already somewhat weak Snake that much more flaccid. The silver lining here is that this allows the level design to reward exploration with more chests that can contain ammo expansions. Outside of that though, I find the decision to make the Snake an ammo-dependent weapon to be a pointless nerf. The machine gun had rechargeable ammo because it was a genuinely powerful weapon that could function as a hover when fully leveled up. The Bubbler had rechargeable ammo because the projectiles came out at an extremely fast rate and they could swarm the field in only a few seconds. Each projectile was weak, but it recharged ammo significantly quicker than the machine gun to compensate. The Snake can't swarm any better than the Polar Star and isn't powerful enough to justify the hilariously low recharge rate. This isn't the only nerf to an old weapon. Both the Bubbler and machine gun have had their ammo count slashed, only to be given back to the player as a reward for backtracking in the form of treasure chests. The idea behind this isn't terrible, and in fact on paper I think it's a pretty good idea, but there's a voice in the back of my head that constantly reminded me that these weapons were lesser compared to their Cave Story counterparts. This feeling was never stronger than when I obtained the Spur. Almost everyone who has used it in the original Cave Story could tell you it was the best weapon in the game. A charge shot with incredible power and an inability to be de-leveled. I'll be honest, it was definitely overpowered, but because of how much trouble you had to go through to obtain it in the original game, its absurd strength felt incredibly rewarding and, dare I say, justified. In a vacuum, the amount of trouble Jenka's Nightmare has the player go through to obtain the Spur isn't nearly as high, which may have justified the nerf. Getting the Spur just requires a visit to the Hermit Gunsmith at a certain point in the game and re-retrieving the Polar Star from the Pignon. When you look at the journey to the Spur holistically though, the amount of hardships the player must overcome easily eclipses the original game, and these hardships are mandatory. Jenka's Nightmare likes to play around with weapon loadouts. For the first couple of areas, the player will obtain a similar amount of guns to the original cave story, with some slight adjustments, like with the snake as mentioned earlier. By the end of the second area, Quote can have access to the Polar Star, Snake, and the Bubbler. Once the boss of the second area is beaten though, Quote is sent on a one-way trip to the bottom of the island, and as a result of the fall, loses all of his weapons. Once again, I have to say that on paper I like this idea. In fact, this underside section was one of the most memorable moments for me because of the setting and the focus on precision platforming without any means of protection. The player isn't left powerless for too long though. Eventually they'll discover the fireball and even the missile launcher a short while later. After these two though, it's an absolute drought. Jenka's Nightmare expects players to progress through a significant chunk of the game with only these two weapons. My issue is this: neither the missile launcher nor the fireball are great general use weaponry. The missile launcher relies on ammo dropped by enemies, so it's best reserved for tough encounters like boss fights. The fireball shines best when it's used against grounded enemies, but a lot of the enemies in the Sand Zone and Labyrinth are airborne. Both of these weapons are meant to supplement your reliable main gun, like your Polar Stars, machine guns, or Spurs. Maybe this is supposed to be the point, and the player is meant to feel out of their comfort zone for this section of the game. If that's true though, then it lasts for far too long. The entirety of the Sand Zone level and half of the Labyrinth must be completed with only the fireball and missile launcher, and even still, the weapon the player reclaims in the Labyrinth is the Bubbler. Which, by the way, has lost any ammo upgrades that has been given prior to its loss. Cave Story had plenty of choices where refusing upgrades in the short term paid off in the long term, sure, but it never took that philosophy into account when it came to treasure chests. If this game gave an option to take the loot from the treasure chest after opening it, I'd have less of an issue with this change. This stretch of gameplay is when Jenka's Nightmare truly starts to feel incredibly difficult and stifling. The player just isn't equipped to deal with the type of enemy encounters the game throws their way. This boss, for example, is a massive spike in difficulty. It's a reskin of the Balfrog fight from the original cave story, with an additional hazard in the form of this guy running back and forth. If he catches you while you're moving, you lose a decent chunk of health, but more importantly, you lose weapon experience. If the player doesn't have a fully powered up fireball for this fight, then they better prepare to be in this arena for a long time, because a level 2 fireball is just too slow to deal with the incoming spam as well as deal decent damage. The lead up to this fight isn't particularly easy to traverse either, so it's quite simple to be stuck in a situation much like the one on display here. Of course, this fight also sports a wordy preamble before the battle begins. But I think the cherry on top is what needs to be done after this fight. A save is very close by, but there's one small obstacle in the way before it can be reached. This obstacle is several moving blocks that instantly kill Quote if he ends up on the wrong side of one. It's not the hardest obstacle to complete in the world, but it's hard enough to screw up if you just barely manage to beat the boss and the nerves begin to take over. Cave Story is a fairly difficult game. Jenka's Nightmare is a cruel game. If its level design isn't brutally difficult, it's introducing puzzles that can be described as trial and error at its best and frustratingly obtuse at its worst. Jenka's Nightmare takes the name of the Labyrinth to heart. Despite it and many levels in the original Cave Story being linear excursions most of the time, the Labyrinth of Jenka's Nightmare sports multiple pathways and door puzzles that were confusing even when I knew the solution. Jenka's Nightmare practically begs the player to use a guide to complete a majority of its puzzles. In fairness, the same could be said for the original Cave Story, at least for one infamous part in particular. But the degree in which Jenka's Nightmare leans into this aspect of Cave Story's game design is not only annoying, but also not the same. In Cave Story, the guide-worthy moments aren't roadblocks for completing the game, they're secrets that lead you towards the definitive ending. Talking to Booster while he's on his deathbed isn't the same as a door puzzle impeding your progress. Because no matter what you do in the Booster situation, the player will always progress further into the game. That progress can't be found when you're stuck on a majority of the puzzles in Jenka's Nightmare. It seems the philosophy for a lot of the difficulty in Jenka's Nightmare comes from attempting to do something from the original Cave Story, but bigger. The last cave wasn't hard enough? Make it even deadlier and put an endgame boss at the end of it all, no saves. The waterway from the original too short? It's now an entire area with branching paths and a camera that makes it hard to tell where quote's going. The times when Jenka's Nightmare decides to branch out and create wholly new areas are the moments that end up being the highlights. The first major level of the game is a new creation, and it's a simple but great linear stage. The Devil's Garden has well-conveyed puzzles, except for the end, and a cool aesthetic. The lead-ups to the Genesis and Oblivion fights are rightfully ominous and are like nothing seen in the original Cave Story, while still feeling faithful to the original game. I know I've been negative for a lot of this video, but it's worth saying that there are times when this game manages to not just look and play like Cave Story, but feel like Cave Story. This applies to the narrative as well. No one feels flanderized, and it's nice to see these characters again. I enjoyed the story to Jenka's Nightmare as a what-if follow-up to the original Cave Story. Until the end. Should the player choose to explore after everything in the story appears to be resolved, they'll be shocked by the stunning revelation that the events of the game were caused not by Jenka, but the Doctor, who managed to survive his defeat at the end of the first game. He blindsides Quote, dispatching him, leaving Curly Brace left to finish the job and defeat the Doctor once and for all. The switch to Curly for the final hour or so of the game is actually pretty well done. Throughout this entire adventure, Curly has been lamenting about how she can't be of much help to you, and in the end, it's because of her that the day is saved. The big reveal of the Doctor, however, I'm less enthusiastic about. If only because Jenka's Nightmare attempts to add narrative tissue that ties the Doctor, the Sakamotos, Curly, and Quote's backstories together. Maybe this bothers me more than it should, but much like my qualms with the level design, when Jenka's Nightmare attempts to expand on the past, it misses its mark the most. Giving Quote and Curly origin stories that make them related to the Sakamotos doesn't feel like it ties a bow on the events of the first game. It feels like an attempt to put together pieces that don't fit. Jenka's Nightmare is one of the most well-known Cave Story mods, for reasons that are clear to anyone who has played it. Jenka's Nightmare is a full-length mod of the original Cave Story that follows up on its narrative. It's a Cave Story 2 in all but name. But it's not Cave Story 2. Nor do I think Jenka's Nightmare wants to be considered a Cave Story 2. To bill itself as a sequel to one of the most critically acclaimed games of all time comes with all sorts of expectations and scrutiny from players and critics alike. And yet, here I am, criticizing it as if it is a sequel. Because while the game might not want to be considered a sequel, the contents inside beg to be compared and contrasted to the game it fashions itself after, and unfortunately it ends up falling short of these comparisons. Jenka's Nightmare assumes that you've played Cave Story. That's why it's harder than the original on average. That's why you can import your save file to receive bonus items. That's why the story assumes you know all these characters. Ironically, when the mod innovates or tries new ideas that lack comparisons to the original Cave Story and finds its own identity, I found the most to like about it. Jenka's Nightmare is mechanically well made, much of the content in store is great even, but it can't ascend above the status of mod and stand toe-to-toe with the game it takes its assets from. There's too many instances of poor or frustrating design to recommend this game to more than just enthusiasts of the original.